Welcome to our next lecture, which is called The Nicene Fathers, Christian Leaders of the 4th Century. So the 4th century is a very critical and pivotal time in church history. As you have seen, we've already gone over the Council of Nicaea, which was definitely a monumental event in the history of the church. And so now we're going to take a look at what are referred to as the Nicene Fathers. So just so you understand the terminology there, Nicene refers to the Council of Nicaea. So the Nicene Fathers would be those church leaders who lived and ministered in and around the time of the Council of Nicaea, meaning basically within that century, within the 300s. And then all the church fathers prior to that are referred to the ante-Nicene fathers, and then all the church fathers following that are called the post-Nicene fathers. So we're going to be looking at the Christian leaders of the 4th century and taking a look at some of the most significant during that time. The first Christian leader of the 4th century that we'll take a look at is Athanasius of Alexandria. Now, you'll remember that we mentioned Athanasius as part of our discussion on the Council of Nicaea, and he was a focal point in that whole event. But we want to take this opportunity to go a little bit more in depth about Athanasius and his ministry in the 4th century following the Council of Nicaea. So as we have already talked about, he was the primary defender against Arianism, which is the teaching that Jesus was created by the Father at some point in time. But Athanasius taught that Christ as the Son of God was identical in essence to the Father. So his most famous writing was called On the Incarnation of the Word of God, in which he defended the true biblical doctrine of the person of Christ. So even though he was just a deacon at the time of the Council of Nicaea, you'll remember that he was a deacon to Alexander, he spent most of the 4th century fighting against Arius. So even though there was a conclusive decision that was brought down at the Council of Nicaea, and they adopted the Nicene Creed, which spelled out the church's position on the deity of Christ. This was not the final word in the argument, and it continued throughout much of the 4th century. And so Athanasius was embroiled in this battle with Arius for the next several decades. So he argued strongly in favor of the eternal sonship of Christ, which included his deity, as well as the doctrine of the Trinity. And both of these are things that Arius denied. And he remained the focal point of the Arian attack even after his death. He was exiled 5 different times from his post as the bishop there in Alexandria. And even though he didn't live to see Arianism defeated finally, his efforts were certainly greatly used by God to keep the church from heresy during that time. His famous quote is Athanasius contra mundum, and that means Athanasius against the world. And what he meant by that was that even if he were the sole upholder of the truth of the deity of Christ and of the Trinity, that he would be prepared to defend it against all its opponents. So Athanasius, we owe much to our understanding of the deity of Christ and the Trinity, and owe much to the church having been delivered from that heresy to Athanasius. Okay, the next leaders of the 4th century that we'll talk about are the Cappadocian Fathers. Now, the Cappadocian Fathers are 3 men, 2 brothers, and a close friend of theirs. And it was Basil of Caesarea, his brother Gregory of Nyssa, and their close friend Gregory of Nazianzus. These 3 are referred to as the Cappadocian Fathers, and they were instrumental in also fighting this same battle following the Council of Nicaea throughout the 4th century against Arianism. So they ministered in Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey, and that's a place where Arianism had really gotten a strong foothold, and the Cappadocian Fathers were instrumental in fighting against the heresy of the teaching that Christ was a created being during the rest of the 4th century following the Council of Nicaea. The next church father from this era that we'll look at is Jerome. Now, Jerome, we could think of him as the scholar of the early church. His scholarship was unsurpassed by anyone during that period. He's most well known for his translation of the Bible into Latin, and is referred to as the Latin Vulgate. And Vulgate means language of the people. It's likened to our word of vulgar, just meaning common. And that was a revolutionary thing during that time, to put the scriptures into the language of the common people so that they could have it for themselves and it wouldn't only be for scholars. By that point in time, Latin had become the predominant language of the western part of the Roman Empire. So most people during that time didn't speak Greek, and so and they certainly didn't speak Hebrew. And all the translations of the Bible up to that point, especially of the Old Testament, had not been translated from the original languages, but they had been translated from the Greek Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Old Testament. But Jerome actually took it upon himself to learn Hebrew. So he spent 5 years as a hermit in the Syrian desert, where he learned Hebrew, and he was one of the few to do that during this time. Not even Augustine knew Hebrew. He felt that the Septuagint was sufficient. So Jerome did a really, really important work there in translating the Latin Vulgate, not only in putting it in a language that the common people could understand and could read, but also in translating the Old Testament from the original Hebrew. He also wrote a lot of Bible commentaries. He was very strong in linguistic and topographical information, and he also contributed to the theological controversies and the doctrinal discussions during that time, such as Arianism and Pelagianism. The next leader we'll take a look at is John Chrysostom. He's known as the expository preacher of the early church fathers. So many of these church fathers are theologians. Jerome was more of a scholar, but John Chrysostom was the preacher of the 4th century and of the early church, really. He was the bishop of Constantinople, and prior to his time of becoming bishop of Constantinople, during his time while he was a priest, he became known as golden-mouthed, and that is what Chrysostom means, is golden-mouthed. And he was called that because of his ability to preach and his great powers of oratory. He delivered several series of homilies or sermons on many books of the Bible. So you can read those today. You can see his homilies on several different books of both the Old and New Testament. As we said, he's known as more of a preacher than a theologian, and this is in contrast to many others, including Augustine, who held to a more allegorical hermeneutic and is known as more of a theologian. But John Chrysostom was against allegorical exegesis, and he insisted on a literal interpretation and exposition of the Scriptures. He's also known for his strong commitment to personal holiness. His honesty, asceticism, and sometimes tactlessness alienated him from other bishops, and this eventually led to his exile. And in his exile, he was forced to travel on foot during the winter, and he eventually died as a result of it. Here's a key quote from John Chrysostom on expository preaching, which is interesting to note. He says, For we ought to unlock the passage by first giving a clear interpretation of the words. What then does the saying mean? We must not attend to the words merely, but turn our attention to the sense and learn the aim of the speaker and the cause and the occasion, and by putting all these things together, turn out the hidden meaning. So it's interesting that even in the 4th century, you have John Chrysostom making a statement on the process of expository preaching and finding and giving the clear meaning and interpretation of the words, which is what we at the Master's College and the Master's Seminary are endeavoring to teach those who are called into pastoral ministry. This is the very thing that we are trying to teach them, and the very same approach that we want them to have to preaching of the Word. And finally, the last leader of the 4th century that we'll take a look at is Augustine of Hippo. It could be pronounced Augustine or Augustine, depending on where you're from. But you'll hear him called both. And he is the most influential of the fathers of the Western Church. He was a prolific writer and theologian, and his presence still looms large in the church. He was born to a Christian mother named Monica, and his father would later come to know Christ through Monica's testimony. So she was a major spiritual influence on Augustine. She prayed deeply for him with tears and consistently for his conversion. And so Saint Monica, if you're in Southern California and you've ever been to Santa Monica, that's named after Augustine's mother. Santa Monica means Saint Monica, and that's who it's referring to. But in his younger days, he was not a Christian, which is why his mother was so concerned for him and was praying so fervently for his salvation. But he was a student of rhetoric and literature and oratory and philosophy, so he was very much into the scholarship and academia of the time. He led an extremely worldly life before his eventual conversion, and his actual conversion is detailed in his book Confessions, and that's where he describes his mother's prayer for him and the process that God used to eventually save him. After his conversion and after 396, he became the Bishop of Hippo, which is modern-day North Africa. It's Algeria, and that's where he stayed and ministered until his death. His most significant works are his Confessions, as we just mentioned, and City of God. And City of God is actually a defense of Christians who were being accused of sacking Rome in 410. So these are not only major works in Christianity, but just in classical literature at large. These are very famous and very influential works that Augustine wrote. His writings are voluminous, and they massively influenced Western civilization and Western thought. His writings develop a Christian philosophy of history and formulate doctrinal positions, which became the basis of controversy. And so the most notable controversy was with regard to the doctrines of grace, and it's in these doctrines that Augustine's teaching becomes very foundational and very significant. So in his writings, we're going to find all 5 points of what would centuries later become known as Calvinism: total depravity, predestination, particular redemption, irresistible grace, perseverance of the saints. And so the most significant controversy that came from his writings was with a monk named Pelagius. So Pelagius's views came to be known as Pelagianism, and they emphasized human ability and free will rather than depravity and sinfulness and the sovereignty of God in salvation. He even taught the possibility of living without sin. So according to Pelagius, The effects of Adam's sin upon humanity was simply that of setting a bad example. So Augustine opposed Pelagius by teaching that man is absolutely depraved, that he has original sin, that he's saved by grace, and that the fall of man included all men. So he emphasized the depravity of human nature due to the sin of Adam, the necessity of divine predestination, and the priority of faith over reason. And his views on predestination grew out of this controversy with Pelagius. So two major battles being fought during the 4th century were between Athanasius and Arius over the deity of Christ and the Trinity. And then later in the 4th and the early 5th century was between Augustine and Pelagius over the depravity of human nature due to the fall of Adam and the nature of sovereign grace. So those are two very foundational and influential doctrines of the church that were starting to become established right here in the 4th century. So this is an overview. This is by no means all of the influential leaders of the 4th century, but this is just a brief overview of those who were perhaps the most influential and the most significant.